Hey folks, welcome back to U.S. History Chat on Thursdays at 1 o'clock, where on this iteration we're doing the history of the Republican Party. So there's a lot to get to today. I spend the morning going over all this material, and honestly an hour is just not enough, but we'll do what we can with it. So I want to start with where we left last week, and that was I left you with the triumph of William McKinley in the election of 1896, when really the Republican Party had wedded itself to big business and talked about the election of 1896 as really the fight for the survival of America, that if the Democrats won, they would destroy the country altogether. So they presented it as sort of this fire and brimstone, us or the deluge kind of an election, and they won. And as I ended with, I told you that their real problem was the money supply in the country at the time, and they really lucked out with the discovery of gold in the Yukon. So that was kind of a plot twist, I suspect, that certainly they didn't see coming. And there's actually great stories about that I unfortunately can't tell you on this time, but who knows? Maybe we'll keep these going. Anyway, so if that were the case, I end with 1896, McKinley's won, everything's going the route of big business, and it looks like, if we stop the story there, we're going to have a very different country and a very different political party than ended up surviving. So what I want to do today is pick up there in 1896, but deal with the real question of the concept of liberalism. This is what I'm about to talk about today, is the period during which the word liberalism changed its meaning dramatically. It went from meaning the idea of a small government that did not crush the individual, so that what you wanted to do under older Lockean liberalism, or the idea of the liberal Republicans I talked about in the 1870s, you wanted to keep the government small in order to keep it from crushing an individual, yet largely through taxation. So the idea of liberalism in the 1870s to protect the individual meant a small government. Under Theodore Roosevelt, that meaning does a 180, and it turns into the idea that you need to have an active government in order to rein in big business, in order to let individuals have equality of opportunity. So the idea of liberalism goes from a small government to protect individual ability to having a big government to rein in business, so that individuals actually are able to rise the way they should be in society. And how that happens, and what I want to walk you through today, is really kind of backward. And I'll explain why that's the case. The people who lead the way into progressivism in the early 20th century are Republicans. And after everything I told you about 1896, you're like, why would the Republicans be doing this? Well, a younger group of Republicans is really disillusioned by the party being taken over so completely by I'm going to turn some stuff up here. Being taken over so completely by big business. So they're really disillusioned by that. And where they come out with it is that they really sign on to the idea that the old guard, as they're going to come to be known, keeps advancing. The idea that America is the greatest country ever. And it's so good, these young people are going to say, it really should be... all right, everyone is saying it's hard to hear. And I don't really know what to do about that. Does that help? I hope that's help. Okay, Gary says it's better. You know what? Okay, that helped a lot. Somebody said, good, volume suddenly went up. Okay, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to start this again. From the top, so that my person can cut it right to here, so that people get the whole story all together if you couldn't hear it before. All right, so let me start again with where I want to go today. And for Betsy here, I'm going to give you a break and a start again. By the way, I really appreciate you guys hanging with me through all the technological stuff. The truth is that I need to get more up to speed on it, but as you can tell, I'm just out straight, so stuff gets dropped, and this is one of the things that really gets dropped. All right. So when I left you last week, I left you with the history of the Republican Party and the idea that in 1896, when the Republicans win in that election, they really frame that election as a conflict between them and the apocalypse. It's either them or follow the Democrats into a world where they've destroyed the economy and the country is going to be going to hell in a handbasket at the hands of the Democrats. And so if we ended it right there, we would end it with a world really gone to oligarchy, to autocrats, to the idea of a very few people, businessmen, really running the country. And that's not what happens. And the story of why that isn't what happens is a really interesting one. And that's the material that I want to cover today. That's the material that talks about why we get a progressive era and why we get a progressive era in this period, in the early 20th century. And it's a funny story because it's a funny story that comes from within the Republican Party. I mean, you just think in 1896, they had just won everything, right? And they should be able to create this world that's dominated by a few businessmen, but they don't. And they don't, I mean, they do to some degree, but they don't to the degree that you would expect them to. And that's because of a revolt from within the party itself of younger people. And they're younger people like Henry Cabot Lodge Sr., he's going to be, some of you may remember Jr., Henry Cabot Lodge Sr., Albert Beveridge of Indiana, Fighting Bob La Follette of Wisconsin, and Theodore Roosevelt, who take a look at what the Republicans stand for, and they say, we can't sign on to this party the way it looks right now. We can't be Democrats because we hate the Democrats, both for what they did during the Civil War, but also for their financial policies in the late 19th century, early 20th century. We are Republicans, but we are not big business Republicans. And this really matters because they do two really important things. First of all, their attempt to redesign American society is almost backward, if you will. They come from the position that starts with that, like the old guard. They say, if America's so great, like you say, and we believe this, if America's so great, then we should spread American values internationally, first of all. But there's a corollary to that. And they say, if in fact we should spread things internationally, we have an obligation to make America itself better. So in a way, progressivism comes from the international push that normally people think of as coming later. It actually comes before. And there's a funny twist here and a really important twist. This is the period when the idea of liberalism goes from meaning a small government that stays out of the way of individual advancement to being a big government that reins back big business to stop individuals from being able to succeed. So we get in this period a switch from that image of the Lockean liberalism from the 1690s and the early 1700s that rises up through American society until the 1870s, when we get the liberal Republicans who are talking about a smaller government so they don't hurt the individual's ability to rise, generally by crushing them through taxation. That flips. It flips in the early 20th century when people like Theodore Roosevelt, say you can't have individual self-determination so long as you have big business crushing individuals. So we need a large government in order to rein back business to give freedom to individuals. So people always ask me, when did liberalism go from meaning a small government to meaning a big government? It's right here in today's material, how that switch happened. And it's a really interesting switch. So let me walk you through this and how this happened. I left you with the idea in 1896 when McKinley runs and people like Teddy Roosevelt, who's not on the ticket or anything, but he's a Republican speaker, they talk about how the Democrats are going to take America to hell in a handbasket. And it's really them, it's really the Republicans or the apocalypse. And you would think coming out of that the Republicans are united, but they're really not. The younger people that I mentioned, people like La Follette in Wisconsin and Henry Cabot Lodge in Massachusetts and Albert Beveridge in Indiana and Teddy Roosevelt coming out of New York, they are really disillusioned with this government that really seems simply to be feeding people at the very top. And they are disillusioned with it way back in the 1880s. And weirdly, the year 1884 is really important. I threaten sometimes to write a book on my favorite year in American history, which is 1883. It's when we get standard time, among other things. And Krakatoa blows. But my next favorite year is 84, because a lot of really interesting things happen in 84. And one of the things that happens then, if you recall from last week, I guess it was, the Republicans are going to run James G. Blaine for president. And Blaine was known as really corrupt. He was known as James G. Blaine, the Continental Liar from the state of Maine. He was a real operator. He's one of those guys, I pick on Jefferson a lot and Salmon P. Chase. Blaine's like that. He's a real climber, and he's not honest, and he is quite possibly corrupt. And they don't like it. They don't like him. And in 84, they really are hoping, younger men are really hoping to get back to the roots of the Republican Party and nominate somebody who's a reformer. And it doesn't work. People like Henry Cabot Lodge and Teddy Roosevelt go to the Republican convention in 84, and people make fun of them. They try and get this reformer through, and it doesn't happen. And it's a really poignant moment right then for Teddy Roosevelt above all, because you may or may not remember the story that in February of 1884, February 14th, Valentine's Day, he lost both his wife and his mother on the same day. His wife died after giving birth to their daughter Alice, and his mother died shortly after, or that same day. I don't remember now which one died first. That same day, and both of them died almost certainly from diseases that were brought into their home from the surrounding city, from the workers who came into their home, and he's very aware of that, and he's distraught. He won't ever mention his wife again. He hands his daughter off to his sister. That's Alice. You may remember stories about Alice. And he's really, this is kind of, he goes to the convention, and this is kind of, he's trying to keep his hand in politics. And when this happens, when they give the nomination to James G. Blaine, he kind of throws up his hands, and he moves out west to Dakota Territory. Now, I've talked about this before. Remember, this is 1884, and it's not going to be until 1889 that the Dakotas are separated into two states. He goes out to his ranch in Dakota Territory, and he's like, this is it. I'm done with politics. I'm done with the East. I'm going to come out here, and I'm going to drown my sorrows in being a cattle rancher. And interestingly enough, I'm going to tell you more about that, but one of the details about that I love is that it's from this moment that we get so many stories from Teddy Roosevelt about how the Westerners are the salt of the earth, and everything is about, that's really where people know how to behave, and I'll tell you more about that. But what I love is he actually gets his top ranch hands from Maine. So for all that you hear so much about the Westerners and all that, there's a number of wonderful books about the men that he actually takes out from Maine there to start his Western ranch. Anyway, so what's interesting about 84, though, is in that moment when Lodge and Teddy Roosevelt are at the convention, they don't bolt the convention. They don't switch and become Democrats. And I want you to think about that a little bit, because it seems kind of obvious to many of us that if you want to change a party, that what you do is you leave it and you walk away. And that is certainly what most reform-minded Republicans did in 1884. They switched sides and voted for Grover Cleveland, the Democratic candidate, a reform candidate, and a man who was known as a reformer, and they switched their votes to him. And in fact, Grover Cleveland is elected in 1884, the first Democrat to sit in the White House since James Buchanan before the Civil War. So the obvious thing to do in many ways was to do precisely that. But Roosevelt and Lodge don't do that, nor does Robert La Follette. He's going to be known as Fighting Bob La Follette, or Bob La Follette in Wisconsin. They stay in the party, and they refuse to become what is called a mugwump. The people who switch parties in 84 are known as mugwumps. If you've ever wondered what that term was, that's what that means. They didn't do that. They stayed within the party, and that's going to give them a lot of clout. And it's really interesting if you read Roosevelt and Lodge, but especially if you read La Follette's autobiography. And by the way, if you ever do, the man had no sense of humor at all. I mean, he's like, it's really kind of rare in history to read people who have like zero sense of humor. He had zero sense of humor, at least doesn't come through in his autobiography if he did. But all three of those men were profoundly affected by what happened in 84. And by watching people walk away from the party and weaken the party. They really did not have a lot of patience after that with anybody who would walk away from a party. And that's gonna matter in how this plays out. So they don't become mugwumps. They stay within the party, and Teddy Roosevelt goes off to Dakota Territory to kind of drown his sorrows in cattle, if you will. Meanwhile, so Teddy Roosevelt's out there. It's like 85 because he's not going to be out there very long. I'm going to finish this thread and bring him back east in just a second. There's a terrible overpopulation of cattle in the plains, and then a terrible drought and a terrible winter that happens in 86, 87. And that's going to kill his herds along with everybody else, and that's what's going to drive him back to the east. But anyway, you might know that from Laura Ingalls Wilder books, the Hard Winter then, or the Long Winter, I guess it was called. Anyway, so while Teddy Roosevelt is messing around with cattle, back east there's another movement afoot, and it's a really interesting movement. And I will tell you, I'm going to give you my version of this, but one of my best graduate students is writing an entirely new dissertation on this that revises this in pretty significant and important ways, and I'll tell you more about that book when it's closer to publication. Anyway, back east, people are looking at rebuilding the Navy, because if you think about the Civil War, we poured money, the U.S. government poured money into the Army and the Navy during the Civil War, and that was very expensive, and it was imperative to do it at the time. But after the war, the U.S. government and Congress do not want to keep funding the military, and they have to fund the Army to some degree because of the upcoming Indian Wars and the ongoing Indian Wars. But they don't want to fund the Navy, because they sit there and say, why would we fund the Navy? Like Europe and Asia are way over there. We don't need a Navy. And the Navy begins to fall into serious disrepair after the Civil War. Really serious disrepair. Well, this is a problem for a number of people. And I love these stories. It's a problem for a number of people for many reasons. We can have a very active merchant marine in this period, and we have a lot of sailors all over the world, especially doing the Asia trade. And I really can't talk a lot about that, but someday I would love to actually write a book on naval history and maritime history in this period, because those were my people. That's why I still am so attached to Maine, is those were my people in the Asian trade, doing flying the ships around Asia, and in the Pacific, and to some degree in the Atlantic, but most of it's in the Pacific after the Civil War. Anyway, so you've got those people out there in their own ships, but there isn't much of a Navy. That's a real problem if you're a naval officer, because there's nowhere to go. So why does this, and you can't move up, you're sort of stagnating in this service where there's no place to go. So why does this matter for the Republican Party? It matters for the Republican Party because I have deliberately thrown into this conversation again and again the name Henry Cabot Lodge. Henry Cabot Lodge is from Massachusetts, and he in Congress represents the area of Boston that has the Charlestown Navy Yard, which is, by the way, the place where the USS Constitution is still berthed. And trivia here, the USS Constitution is still a commissioned warship. So theoretically, the president could call her out to fight in a war. Of course, that's never going to happen. I mean, one hopes it's never going to happen, but it's just kind of a cool piece of trivia there. Anyway, he is in the representative. He represents the Charlestown Navy Yard. And of course, the Navy Yards, especially in the East Coast, would love to have more work for the U.S. Navy, because there's good money in that, and his constituents would love to have it. And so he's really interested in rebuilding the Navy. And he's also married to the daughter of an admiral. So the admirals hang out in his house, and they talk about how they can't get anywhere. And meanwhile, the Congress is saying we don't need a Navy. And in this period, there's a very famous book written, and it's a book called by Alfred Thayer Mahan, called "The Influence of Sea Power on History," and it's still in print, by the way. And it says, you basically can't have a Navy unless you can't have a strong government unless you have a really strong Navy. So naval officers start to read this book and say, hey, look, we need a Navy here. And like this book says. Meanwhile, I mentioned to you that Henry Cabot Lodge and Teddy Roosevelt are friends after 1884. And you got to remember, Teddy Roosevelt is also interested in the Navy because his mother, who was a Bullock, had brothers who were in the Confederate Navy. And he was fascinated by the stories that his mother told. And when he was at Harvard for his senior thesis, he wrote the history of the War of 1812. And in that, he claims that it was essentially the U.S. Navy that won the War of 1812. That, we talked at the time about the importance of the Army in 1812. He says, no, no, no. It was all about the Navy. So there is this growing interest in developing the Navy. There's also a number of other reasons that I'm actually going to leave to my student. I'm not going to steal his thunder on this. But there is this growing push to fund the Navy. So now there's something else that's going to happen, and I know I'm in the weeds here for a lot of you, but it's imagine living through this period, the 1890s, and I mentioned last week the tariff of 1890, the McKinley Tariff of 1890, and you think tariffs, and yeah, the guys were like fighting in Congress and screaming at each other over this tariff, but like, how did that play out? Well, I could tell you how it played out in South Dakota, which led to a massacre of Lakota people. But it also played out in terms of American expansion, because one of the things that the McKinley Tariff does is it puts a tariff on sugar products. And you don't really think about it, but sugar is really, really important. We all love sugar, or if you don't, you're one of the lucky ones. I certainly love sugar. And sometimes I say to my kids, my students, it's the gateway drug to everything else, because once people get sugar and can get their hands on sugar, they always want more of it. And sugar leads to a lot of international development around certain economic practices simply because it's so incredibly popular. And in fact, in the period of the 1890s, the Sugar Trust was the biggest and most important trust in America. You hear about steel, you hear about jute, you hear about all those things. The Jute Trust is very important because it's what makes the bags that people pick cotton with. You hear about those, but it's sugar that really matters. So anyway, the 1890 McKinley Tariff puts a tariff on sugar products. And what that means is that sugar growers in the island nations suddenly want to become part of America because they don't want to pay that tariff. And this is going to matter a lot for the expansion of America in this period, is the fact that sugar growers want in. And so what does this look like? In 1893, sugar growers in Hawaii launch a revolution against Queen Liliuokalani, who is the leader of the island nation, and they claim that, and they say, oh, we had a revolution, we're now pro-America, and we want to become Americans. And they come to the U.S. government in early 1893 and say, hey, let us in. And Benjamin Harrison, remember him, the big pro-business Benjamin Harrison, says, sure, come on in. We'd love to have you. And of course, he is about to hand over reins in 1893 to Grover Cleveland, who's been elected yet again in 1892, and he takes office in March of 1893. And when he takes office, he looks at what happened in Hawaii, which was pretty clearly an engineered coup by Americans, and he says, no, we're going to collect some information about this. So Hawaii is going to twist out there in the wind for a while they try and figure out whether or not it's actually been a legitimate switch of government or a coup. I mean, it was a coup, but that's not going to matter to Americans in about 5 years. So Hawaii is out there, and if you've ever read about the Sandwich Islands, that's what Americans called Hawaii in this period. So that's out there. Now, meanwhile, while this is going on, there's also a really big problem for Americans. And by the way, I know I sound like I'm just going through general history, but this all ties back to the Republican Party, I promise. Meanwhile, there's another problem at America's doorstep, and that's Cuba. So Cuba in the 19th century is dominated by Spain. It's a Spanish colony. And this has been a thorn in Americans' sides really in the entire post-Civil War period, because if you think about it, Cuba's really close to America, and Americans are really deeply involved in business there, especially in sugar. And they tend to work with Spanish colonists, but at the same time, they're not really very keen on having Spain that close, but they also don't want a Cuban Revolution. And again, Americans and either Spanish or Cuban revolutionaries clash over Cuba in this period. And that's a real glossing over of the entire relationship between Spanish and Cubans in Cuba and Americans with both of those groups. but it's a complicated story, and the only point I'm trying to make here is that it's people tend to think that the Spanish-American War comes out of the blue, and it doesn't. We almost went to war in 1873 down there, and Americans have been watching Cuba, and many Southern Americans really believe that Cuba should be American. They have always had an interest in Cuba. They want to take Cuba. And if you remember, and you probably don't, but if you remember from your high school or college history classes, the concept of the Knights of the Golden Circle, the pro-slavery group in the South. The Golden Circle was the Caribbean, including Cuba. It's the circle down from America, from Florida to Texas to the Yucatan Peninsula, Cuba, and back up to Florida. That's the Golden Circle, as they called it. Anyways, so Americans are really interested in getting control of Cuba. And meanwhile, there is a really, really interesting Cuban Revolution going on for a number of years. And I just don't have the time really to go into that Cuban Revolution. Great, great books on it. If you want the American perspective on the Cuban Revolution, in brief, I did write about it in my West from Appomattox book. You can probably grab that much on Google Books, and you certainly can get it in a library. The Cuban revolutionaries are really fighting back strongly against the Spanish colonial power in their island. And that causes problems in America, because for the American business interests, again, especially the sugar interests, really don't want the revolutionaries to have power. And they're kind of caught ideologically because they don't like the idea of the revolutionaries. At the same time, they don't want to come out and say, yeah, we're on the side of a foreign power, of a colonial power. But business interests like Spain being in charge of Cuba because they preserve the status quo, and they're pulling money out of that island hand over fist. So business people want Spain to reassert its power. Meanwhile, if you remember, in America, increasingly Americans are angry at business power. And so they're looking at what's going on in Cuba, and they're like, we don't like the Spanish hanging out there. We don't think this is a good idea. And we kind of think the revolutionaries are not so bad, but we're also not real keen on the color of the revolutionaries. So Americans don't really know how to deal with what's going on in Cuba. And then something dramatic happens. At the end of the 1890s, Spain really feels the need to reestablish control over Cuba really dramatically, really quickly. And they send a new person to regain control over the island. His name is Valeriano Weyler. And he institutes a policy called the Reconcentrado policy, which is, he actually says, I'm going to tell you an aside about this too. He actually says that you need to if you're a Cuban, a native to Cuba, you need to report to certain towns, to be concentrated in certain towns, or you will be considered a rebel. Now, what's interesting to me about this, and this is only to me, and I've never explicitly made this connection in the papers, but I would love for someone to do so. Isn't that exactly what the U.S. government said to Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull in 1875, when I was telling you about that last week, that they had to report back to a certain place, to be concentrated in a certain place, or be considered a rebel and be hanged? That's what Weyler says in Cuba. In America, it was expect war. I just find the parallels between those two things really interesting, and I would love it for someone to chase that down. Anyway, Weyler says they got to show up in these towns or they're going to be considered rebels and they're going to be hanged. But here's the problem. It's always the problem with concentration camps, because that's what concentration camps are. You concentrate people in a small space. That's not the same as a death camp. A death camp is when you concentrate people and in order to kill them, in order to go ahead and create mass death. But that being said, concentration camps almost always have extraordinarily high numbers of dead, because when you put people together, they spread disease, and almost invariably the places where they are concentrated do not have the food, shelter, and clean water that they need to handle that many people. And you see this not only in deliberate cases like the Rinconcentrado policy or like some of the other concentration policies that you can think of. You also see it in communist societies after World War II when they tried to move populations around really quickly. They often ended up with really, really high death rates, in part because of the dislocation of people as much as, and the conditions that produced, as much as by deliberation. So anyway, so you have this problem of the Rinconcentrado policy and the Spanish coming down really heavy-handedly on the Cuban people, and the death rates soar. It's really horrific how many people begin to die, and the images that come back to America of the Cubans who simply want, according to their documents, to have to get rid of their colonial overlords, and they all they want is essentially the freedom that their northern neighbors have, and they're suffering in huge amounts because of that. All right, so when that happens, a lot of Americans, like those young Republicans, I told you they were going to come back into the story, like those young Republicans who believe in the American mission and believe that America is as great as the old guard says they are, those people start to say, well, we need to go and stop this. We need to go and stop the death, the horrific numbers of dead that are happening, on Cuba, which is in our backyard. Meanwhile, the business interests in the country, especially the sugar growers, like, no, we're good. Just keep the Spanish in control. We need to go ahead and make sure that these rebels are put down, because we want Cuba to be under the same system it's been under, because it's making us a lot of money. When this happens, increasingly, people like Teddy Roosevelt and Albert Beveridge and the younger guard, the younger men, they want to make a name for themselves. And they keep saying, you guys are wrong. You old guard are only interested in money. You're weakening this country. We need to rejuvenate the American sense of mission. And this, increasingly, they keep pressing the old guard, the Republicans, to go ahead and go into Cuba and get rid of and protect the Cuban people there. And they demanded of McKinley, and this is a really interesting moment, because William McKinley, who's totally a big business guy, by the way, remember, he was also at Antietam. He was actually a soldier at Antietam, the terribly bloody day of Antietam back during the Civil War. And he says, I have been through one war. I have seen the dead piled up, and I do not want to see another. So one of the differences between the old guard is their pro-business slant, but also a lot of them actually remember the Civil War. The younger people don't. They didn't fight in the Civil War. Theodore Roosevelt was a boy when the troops came marching back by his house in 1864 and 1865. And so they see war as somehow really glorious, where people like McKinley, who had lived through Antietam, are like, there's just no way I want to bring American boys into a war like that. So this is going to play out. I can't obviously give you the entire history of the Spanish-American War, but I'm going to give you how it plays out in America and in the Republican Party. February 15th of 1898, the USS Maine explodes in Havana Harbor. And how she got to Havana Harbor is itself an interesting story that I don't really have a lot of time to go into. People who are interested in taking Cuba, in protecting the Cubans there, urged the U.S. government to send her, and she probably explodes because of an accident in her powder magazine. Nonetheless, there was really no reason at all for Spain to mine the USS Maine, because Spain desperately wanted the U.S. to stay out of the conflict in Cuba. Nonetheless, U.S. newspapers insist that this has been an attack of war against the United States. Theodore Roosevelt, who is then Assistant Secretary of the Navy, agrees that it has been an attack of war against the United States. And he insists that we should go to war over what happened to the Maine and to protect the Cubans. And this is a really interesting moment, because at one point there's a dinner in New York City, and there's a club in New York City that's famous for roasting politicians. And you see this to some degree now in that annual press dinner or whatever it is that they have in Washington, and they have a comedian who roasts the president. This was actually a really common thing with the Gridiron Club. They were an eating and drinking club in in Washington, and they would roast a politician. And again, I'm going to go a little bit off topic here. William Howard Taft hated them like poison. He hated having to go to dinner there, but it was one of those things you sort of had to. And it was all the press that made up jokes at the expense of whatever politician. It wasn't just the president, whatever politician was there, and they were vicious. And if you're interested, there is a book about those dinners on Google Books called Gridiron Nights. And this is where the story that I'm going to tell you comes from, is the Gridiron Nights book. All right, so they're at this dinner, and Mark Hanna, who is really the chief operative of the old guard in the Republican Party, is down at one end of a table, and he's like, "Nah, we're not going to go to Cuba. We're not going to war for Cuba. This is a stupid thing. It's going to blow over. We'll make sure we don't go to war in Cuba." And Theodore Roosevelt's at the other end of the table, and he stands up and he shakes his fist at Mark Hanna, and he says, "We will have this war for the freedom of Cuba in spite of the timidity of the commercial interests." And that's recorded in that book that he does that. You might have seen that in textbooks. That's where it comes from. All right. So what happens then is that in one of those weird quirks of fate, the Secretary of the Navy is away making Theodore Roosevelt, who is then the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a position he got thanks to Henry Cabot Lodge after William McKinley is elected. He says to Admiral George Dewey, who is the head of the naval fleet in the Pacific, he's stationed down in Hong Kong, to go ahead and steam over to the Philippines, which is also under Spanish control, and take the Philippines the minute that he hears there is any sort of a war announcement between America and Spain. And this is a really important moment, because we often put I call two wars together, the war in Cuba and the war in the Philippines, and they are literally on opposite sides of the world from each other. The only things they have in common are that Spain is involved in both. Those are two colonial powers, that sugar is involved in both, and that the United States is involved in both. But in each case, there's a lot of really important differences. So what happens is, after the explosion of the USS Maine, in fact, skip ahead a little bit, Congress does declare war on Spain. As soon as that happens, Teddy Roosevelt orders Dewey to go ahead and get rid of the Spanish in the Philippines. He does. He steams his fleet over to Manila Bay and lands there. He doesn't land. He gets into the harbor on April 25th and gives that very famous order on the USS Olympia: "You may fire when ready, Gridley." And Gridley does. By the way, you can go and see the Olympia in Philadelphia now. It's a really, really good tour. It's a really interesting boat if you're interested. I went and saw it last year, and it was actually really cool to see. Anyway, they go ahead, they sink the Spanish fleet in the port of Manila, and in fact, they don't really have any troops. It happens so quickly. Over the course of the next several months, about 12,000 Filipino insurgents who have been trying to get rid of Spanish control for a long time join with 11,000 Americans, and they drive the Spanish out of Manila by about mid-August. So that's that war out there. And it's important to remember that that war is going to go on for a while, and that while business interests had been dead set against the war in Cuba, they're dead in favor of the war in the Philippines. And that really matters because taking the Philippines and the islands that are around the Philippines is going to say a lot about American expansion into the Pacific, and again about sugar. You remember, the Philippines are producing sugar like nobody's business in this era. And I wish I could tell you more about Philippine history, and I can't. Anyway, meanwhile, back home in America, after the U.S. declares war, volunteers swarm into recruiting offices to volunteer. There are more than 200,000 men volunteering for this war. And they're mostly Southerners, which is, again, really interesting, because they are talking about restoring American individualism, taking back America from big business that has taken it over. They feel like this is their way of becoming men again. And of course, this is really what Roosevelt himself hammers home again and again that this is a war for American values, for independence, for individualism, for the little guy. And the people who are volunteering in huge numbers are volunteering primarily from small towns. It's a small town war. Most of these men are not going to see service, of course, and I'll explain that in a minute. But it's really interesting that this is not a draft. This is people pouring into recruiting offices saying, send me, send me. I want to be part of this whole move to advance, justice and liberty and truth in the American way, and to do it by imposing American weight in favor of the Cuban people in this war. It's a really interesting moment. So what happens is when there is this call for these volunteers, who shows up? As I say, the young men from small towns initially show up, but one of the first people to offer to gather together people to go fight this war is Buffalo Bill. Buffalo Bill, who represents the cowboy and individualism and everything that I've talked about in so many of the things that I write in these talks I've done. Buffalo Bill says he's going to raise a regiment. You know who else does? Frank James. Jesse James's brother says, I could raise a cowboy regiment and I could get rid of the Spanish colonial powers just like that. Well, who gets the cowboy regiment, though? You know where this is going. Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt gets a commission to raise a regiment, initially in the unorganized territories, but it's going to, in the organized territories, places that are not states. But quickly he gets permission to take people from anywhere he wants. And he does not take command himself of the regiment. He gives it to somebody else. He's second in command. Really smart move on his part, by the way. He also manages to take 3 photographers with him who are really phenomenal photographers. And that's why we know as much as we do about what happened with the Roosevelt Regiment in Cuba. And I will tell you a little bit more about that in just a second. So anyway, he gets these people, and you have all these volunteers, and you have this Roosevelt Regiment as well. And he maintains that this regiment is simply regular men, that they don't. It doesn't matter if they're from Harvard. He says he's got people from Harvard. He's got immigrants. He's got African Americans. He's got indigenous peoples. He says it doesn't matter. They are all individuals who want nothing of the government. They simply want to go and fight for American values. And they are all equally good, he keeps saying. And they get dubbed very quickly the Rough Riders. And they're called the Rough Riders after the Rough Riders in Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And there's this whole idea of this Western individualism taking over Cuba. Well, on June 30th, 1898, 17,000 U.S. troops landed in Santiago in Chile, and the next day about 7,000 of them charge up San Juan Hill and the neighboring Kettle Hill to take the heights around the city. And the Spanish ships try to escape from the harbor, and the U.S. Navy sinks all 7 of them. One of the things that is always interesting to me about this is so many of us have the image of the charge up San Juan and Kettle Hill with the men on horseback because they were the Rough Riders, right? They were not on horseback. And the reason for this, and here's a little piece of lore that is, you're not going to read it or see it anywhere else. It's from my experience doing research in Harvard's Teddy Roosevelt collection. They had an absolutely phenomenal archivist who did nothing but take care of that collection. And the man he knew everything about everything. He could look at a photograph and he could say to you, oh, that's so-and-so. And he came back and married so-and-so. And they had 3 kids, one of whom died of polio. And I mean, he just knew absolutely everything. And he said to me, I got to spend a day with him because I was looking for a really specific couple of images from the photographers I told you about, and I knew they would be in the big plates. Actually, I didn't think they would let me go down into the vaults, and they did. I had no idea. You get in this little teeny tiny. You have to wear a badge. You have to apply for a badge and get a badge. And even still, I just thought it meant they were going to bring the material up to me. It didn't. It meant they let me get into this teeny tiny elevator, and like at the size of this mug, with this guy, and go down into the vaults in Harvard's rare books library. And literally you're down there in this climate-controlled, dark, large space, and you're walking down these metal shelves, these long, long aisles of metal shelves. And I look over to my right side, and there's a Gutenberg Bible sitting there. I mean, it's just like, you don't want to touch anything. Anyway, down there he had all the plates from the photographers, and they're big glass plates from the photographers who were with Roosevelt. And so he's showing me this stuff, and we're going through this collection. And I actually said to the man, "Are you going to write all this down?" And he said, "No, when I go, it'll all go with me." And it just is, anyway. He said to me, I was looking for plates of the horses, and he said to me, "Oh, there weren't horses in there, because when they put the horses on the ships to go to Cuba, they left the horses on the ships too long. So when they went to get them off in Cuba, they pushed, I'm sorry, it's awful. I should tell you this, like trigger warning here. They pushed the horses off the ships, and they all sank and drowned. So there were no horses in the charges in those first two charges up San Juan Hill and Kettle Hill. The images that you see of Teddy Roosevelt and his men on horseback are taken later on when they come back to America, and they are stationed briefly in New York, outside of New York City, and before they're demobilized, and then they hold rodeos, and they hold all kind of horse shows, and that's why you see horses. You see pictures of the Rough Riders on horseback. They weren't on horseback in Cuba because the horses had died. They're resupplied with horses when they get back to New York. All right. Anyway, that was just an aside, but isn't it cool? All right. So then the Cuban side of the war goes by really quickly. And John Hay, who is right then, he had been Lincoln's secretary. He'd written a best-selling novel in 1883, another 1883 date. He writes to Teddy Roosevelt that this has been, and this is a very famous quote, "a splendid little war begun with the highest motives, carried on with magnificent intelligence and spirit, favored by that fortune which loves the brave." When Roosevelt comes back to New York after Cuba, as I say, he gathers with his men on Montauk, actually, I believe is where they're stationed, on Montauk, and holds these rodeos. People come out and see him. And he comes back, if you will, loaded for bear. He knows he's got a political movement behind him. He has given up a good government position to sort of be an outsider. One of the things he does when he is in Cuba is he's angry about the way his men are being treated by the government. He thinks they are being killed by disease, and the government is not taking that seriously enough. So he goes above the government and goes to the press, and the press it reports his report that the government is not taking care of his men, and instantly the government has to do something. And he boasts that he has cut through red tape. I think I told you before maybe that memos in government memos used to be wound in red ribbon. It's not really like you think of a ribbon. It's kind of like it's almost like a wick almost, but it's thinner red material. It's known as red tape. He has cut through red tape to get his men out and to safety. And he knows that he's got a really good shot at becoming governor. And that's exactly what happens. He runs for governor of New York, and he's going to win in a landslide in just a minute. Meanwhile, America is sort of through in Cuba, but very much still fighting the Philippines. That is a guerrilla war that's going to go on for a long time. It's America's precursor, if you will, to Vietnam. And in a really interesting moment, there is waterboarding. This is maybe for you guys who remember the George W. Bush administration. America's Philippine allies waterboard in the Philippines, waterboard the insurgents there, because very quickly the U.S. government turns against the insurgents with whom they have worked, and they try and put them down, and they engage in waterboarding, and Congress gets wind of this and goes ballistic, says Americans do not waterboard. This absolutely should not be taking place. And it's sort of an interesting moment considering what's happened in the late 20th century. Anyway, so the Philippines is still very much on the table. And I'm sorry, another aside here, and I don't have time really to go into depth about this, although I will run past the hour because I started this twice, as you remember. Philippine history is fascinating. It's really amazing. So if anybody's even like a little bit interested, start digging, because it's just amazing stuff. And I know almost none of it really, as much as anybody should, but anyway, it's a really interesting history. Anyway, so That's very much on the table in 1898. Like, what are we going to do with the Philippines? Like, we've decided after Cuba that we're not going to take Cuba. There's a resolution early on that we're not going to take over Cuba. But what about the Philippines? I mean, that's really a different war, right? Well, it is a different war. And what happens is in 1898, these younger Republicans make taking the Philippines their cause. They say that if America's as great as you all are saying, you old guard, then we ought to spread our values overseas. And Albert Beveridge from Indiana, who's a great speaker, begins to make it his cause. And he gives a famous speech in 1898 called The March of the Flag. And you can find it everywhere. You probably read it in high school and had no idea what it was about. And he says, you know, we really need to take over the Philippines and everywhere because America is really great. Now they're doing it partly ideologically, but they're also doing it because it's an issue that sets them apart from that old guard, and they think they can get voters on board with that. And the old guard, people like Andrew Carnegie, look at that and they're like, what are you talking about? You know, why would we spend money on the Philippines? Why would we force our way of life on people who don't want it? And the old guard looks at the idea of expansion overseas, and they really don't like that idea because they don't like the spread of the how much money it's going to take. At the same time, businessmen really, really, really like the idea of getting the control of the Philippines and, as I say, their sugar, as well as a fueling port on the way to Asia. But the Philippines is less important as a fueling station than Samoa is. And Samoa is itself a really interesting story that I don't have time to go into, but they're really more interested in Samoa for coal and the Philippines for sugar. All right, so they start to say that in order to reclaim, they tie these two things together. In order to reclaim America from big business, we have to go and take the Philippines. I mean, again, it's pretty counterintuitive, I think, to us, but it works in 1898. And you get this rise of younger Republicans saying, we must spread American values overseas. And you see this in Beveridge. You see this in Henry Cabot Lodge, who wants the Navy. And certainly you see it in Teddy Roosevelt. But, and here's the big but, if this is the case, they say, if America is so great, we got to take the Philippines and Samoa and all, you know, the Sandwich Islands. By the way, they take Hawaii almost instantly as soon as the Spanish-American War breaks out. If this is so great, we got to clean up home. We got to get rid of the terrible conditions at home that are making it so that workers can't rise, that they can't feed their families, that we're raising citizens in squalor, without educations, in dirt. You know, we're turning them into slaves in a sense, under the system of freedom of contract as opposed to true freedom. And we must clean that system up, or we're going to destroy our system from within. So what I'm trying to set up here is that the whole idea of a progressive Republican Party does not sort of go from being a progressive Republican Party to being imperialist. It's the other way around. They become imperialist over Cuba and then over the Philippines and the idea that America is just so ducky it's got to take everybody. But if that's the case, then they got to clean up America. And that reversal is itself a really interesting one. And that's the grounds on which people like Roosevelt and La Follette decide that they're going to clean up America. And quite literally, Teddy Roosevelt says he's going to resurrect Abraham Lincoln's ideology. And he says he is for, quote, both the man and the dollar, but in case of conflict, the man before the dollar. All right, so how does this play out? Obviously, Roosevelt is interested in regulating big business, especially the sugar trusts, but some other things as well. He begins, this is where I say that you get the switch from liberalism being small government to liberalism meaning a big government that can regulate business. And on the basis of what happened in Cuba with the Rough Riders, Roosevelt does, in fact, win the New York governorship. And he wins it with the idea that he's going to bring his new brand of individualism to the U.S. government. I mean, it's a really, or to government first, and soon it's going to be the U.S. government. It's a really weird idea in a sense. The idea that the man who believes in individualism should control the government to protect that individualism for Americans by regulating business. It's almost a sleight of hand, but you can see this switch of what liberalism means. If you're going to protect those cowboys, you got to stop big business. So if you're going to protect individualism, you got to regulate the Sugar Trust and some of the other trusts as well. So how does this play out? He's very popular, and it's clear to the old guard who still runs the Republican Party that they need to shut him up. So what they do is they convince him to take the vice president slot in the 1900 election. William McKinley is going to be running as a member of the old guard. He's as old guard as they come, McKinley is. So he's going to they're going to run McKinley as a big business guy. They're also going to run Teddy Roosevelt as a reformer. They're going to bury him in that VP slot. And he's not sure he wants to do it because he recognizes that it's kind of a place where careers go to die. But he finally decides, he might have a bully pulpit. Bully meaning a grate, that's what that means, and a pulpit meaning a place where he can speak. So the bully pulpit he used bully for, it's good, it's bully. So he's going to have a bully pulpit, and he says, okay, I'll take it. Once he becomes vice president, he is bored out of his mind. He's so bored that he actually goes to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and asks if he can go back to law school because he's so bored he can't just sit around. And the Chief Justice is horrified, and he says, no, you can't go back to law school, but if you want to learn law, I will study with you because we can't have the vice president back in law school. So he's bored out of his mind. And while this is going on, they get elected in November of 1900, and they are not going to take, McKinley's not going to take office until March of 1901. In February of 1901, J.P. Morgan creates a really important new entity, and that new entity is U.S. Steel. And U.S. Steel is important because it is capitalized. It's important because it pulls together business. It's important for lots of reasons, but for my purposes today, it's important because it is capitalized at $1.4 billion, which is 3 times the U.S. budget, the U.S. annual budget. So it just illustrates to everybody that the rich guys have everything. And there's shortly going to be a study of just how many strings J.P. Morgan pulls. So that's happening, and Teddy Roosevelt is bored. He's asked if he can start studying law. Meanwhile, he leaves Washington. He's got nothing to do, and everything seems like it's going to go on in a certain direction, with big business continuing to control society. And then in September of 1901, an immigrant who people call an anarchist, I'm not entirely sure he was an anarchist. That's kind of a later story. Anyway, his name is Chalgos, and he shoots William McKinley in Buffalo, New York, actually in his stomach in Buffalo, New York, which is always one of those poignant moments for me. I'm not a McKinley fan. I really don't like the man in many ways, lots of ways, most of the ways. But it's so weird to me that he lived through Antietam and then he dies with a bullet in his stomach, a little bullet in his stomach. Anyway, of course, when McKinley is assassinated, that means that Roosevelt is now going to be president, quite unexpectedly. And as he writes to Cabot Lodge, he writes him, this is so Roosevelt, he writes to Cabot Lodge and he says, "It is a dreadful thing to come into the presidency this way, but it would be a far worse thing to be morbid about it." Anyway, so he comes into power. And Mark Hanna, I mentioned him before, he was McKinley's handler, sort of the old guard's bundler, not bundler, wrong word. He was the guy in charge of the old guard and in charge of getting the old guard elected. He says, and I quote, "I told McKinley it was a mistake to nominate that wild man at Philadelphia. I told him what would happen if he should die. Now look, that damn cowboy is president of the United States." Anyway, so what happens is, this is September, McKinley, the transition is going to take a while. And on November 13th, something else happens. And that's that Morgan brings together all the railroads in the country as the Northern Securities Company. And the Northern Securities Company is even bigger than U.S. Steel. And it sort of horrifies everybody, even the Chicago Tribune, which is a really pro-business Republican paper, is like, whoa, this never happened before. And Midwestern states, you may remember I talked about the Grangers before last week, who are really nervous about railroad monopolies. Midwestern states start to say, we're gonna stop this conglomeration because we think it's dangerous. And when that happens, Northern Securities simply says, well, good luck with that, because we're not going to tell you what we're doing. Where there's not going to be any transparency at all for what we're planning to do. And this is in November, and Teddy Roosevelt, I'm sorry, Theodore, he hated Teddy. Theodore Roosevelt has only been president for like a minute and a half. That's not true. He becomes president in September, and this happens in November. But the next month, in his first address to Congress, which is itself a really interesting moment because it's not done in person in this era, and he actually sends it to Congress in tooled leather with this really fancy binding because, he's Teddy Roosevelt. He's not going to do anything in anything other than a regal way, right? So anyway, he sends it to Congress, and people are really nervous. They're like, he's a reformer. What's he going to do? The businessmen are like, we could be in real trouble. And all he really says is, you need to be transparent. That, like, stop it, you guys. Tell us what you're doing. And if you've gone afoul of laws, we'll go ahead and stop it. Well, the Northern Securities is like, hey, we're good. They take a look at all the fact he's calling for transparency, and they're like, we thought he was going to be crazy. He's not. We'll just ignore him. Bad move to ignore Theodore Roosevelt. He starts to go after the trusts, and the first trust he really goes after in a big way is Northern Securities. And what he does is he goes and starts to hit them under antitrust legislation. And I didn't tell you about antitrust legislation, but just take my word for it. There is antitrust legislation. It doesn't have a lot of teeth, or it hadn't until this moment. And J.P. Morgan is horrified to hear that the president is going after his businesses, and he says to the attorney general, he sends a message to Roosevelt, and he says, if we've done anything wrong, send your man, by which he means the attorney general, send your man to my man, and they can fix it up. And the attorney general responds, we don't want to fix it up. We want to stop it. And this is a really big moment because it signals that the U.S. government is not going to be working any longer in favor of big business, that it's really going to be trying to regulate big business in order to make it possible for people far lower down on the totem pole to rise up and have equality in American society. And Roosevelt would say to you that he meant this even-handedly, that he meant that every man should have a square deal. He's not going to call it a square deal for a while, but every man should have a square deal. In reality, he has very clear ideas about who he includes in that group. He will include workers, for example, but not organized workers. He's against labor unions. He will include indigenous peoples who are willing to join mainstream American society, but not what were derogatorily called at the time blanket Indians, Indians who would not participate in American society. Those he is perfectly willing not only to cut out, but to kill, and you see that in his writings. He's willing to include African Americans like Booker T. Washington, whom he invites to eat with him at the White House, which sends a lot of white Southerners into an absolute spiral, but not African Americans who are organizing for the federal government to level the playing field between them and Southern whites. So what you see here is Roosevelt taking over the government for that individualist ideal, an ideal that within it contains racism and sexism as well, but the idea that the government should help regular Americans, ordinary Americans rise and not be crushed by big business who can take off their arms and legs without paying reparations, who can work them to death, who make sure there isn't time for kids to go to school, who can poison households with things like, this is one of my favorite stories. There, of course, until Roosevelt, we don't have any regulations on food and drink. So one of the things that people used to do with candy was they used to paint candy. So that whole thing about don't take candy from strangers, and by the 20th century that's interpreted as because they're going to lure you into their van and drive away with you. Don't take candy from strangers is actually a reference originally to the fact that candy, unless you knew where it came from, could be painted with lead paint. It would look all pretty and nice, but it was deadly. Similarly, ice cream vendors who are going to be ubiquitous in city streets by the late 19th century are going to take their ice cream as it melts, scoop it all back up, and refreeze it for the next day. And of course, by then, it's like an express train ticket to salmonella because it's all made with raw eggs. So he's going to clean that up. He's going to push back against big business to make sure that people can rear their children in health and safety, or to try and make sure of that. And so we get clean food and drug acts. We get the rise of kindergartens in America, the idea that people should have access to schools and to public schools, and that people should be able to do that. By the way, the person who pushes kindergartens in America is actually the wife of Carl Schurz, whom I mentioned a bunch of times ago. There's only like 6 people in America in the 19th century, and they do the rest with mirrors. Anyway, so increasingly, Roosevelt goes to work with people who are trying to regain a vision of America that permits ordinary Americans to rise. That vision is itself quite limited by race especially, but also by gender. They're not including women fully in the idea of participating in society as equals. But there is this sense that in order for ordinary Americans to rise as Lincoln said they could, there needs to be an activist government that regulates business and that provides a basic safety net for workers when they are injured or when they are unable on their own to live their lives. This is really an idea pushed in Wisconsin by Bob La Follette, who came out of the early post-war period looking at what the Grangers were trying to do. And he comes up with what's known as the Wisconsin idea. And I want to mention this because you saw this with Scott Walker most recently destroying the Wisconsin idea, quite literally taking it on and saying we're getting rid of that. He wiped it out of the mission of the University of Wisconsin. And the Wisconsin idea was one that Roosevelt adhered to and that later on Eisenhower is going to adhere to. And it was the idea that if you brought together labor people, business, college professors, and government, so economic interests, government interests, and academics into sort of think tanks, they could come up with ideas that were the best to make society move forward. This was the progressive idea, to progress society by bringing the stakeholders in together with expert advice to create new programs that would enable the country to do best for the most people. And Roosevelt quite literally picks up La Follette's Wisconsin idea. Wisconsin becomes, as people say, the laboratory for democracy, and this is why. And Roosevelt picks that up quite literally by talking with La Follette and by endorsing La Follette's books and books that look at what's happening in Wisconsin. And he pushes this idea. Roosevelt pushes the idea of progress and government regulation from his bully pulpit, and he does it really, really well. But Roosevelt has said he's not going to run for a third full term or a second full term after being reelected in 1904. And what that means is in 1908, the question is what's going to happen. And essentially, Roosevelt hands off the presidency to a handpicked successor, William Howard Taft. And William Howard Taft is going to be very important for the entire 20th century. He's a funny choice because while Roosevelt is all action, Taft is all inaction. Taft, the first thing he does after getting elected is go play golf because he's so exhausted. And he's obviously quite fond of his meals. He's a large president, and he likes to think. All he wants to do is sit on the Supreme Court. He doesn't really want to be a mover and a shaker. And many historians have speculated that the real political power in his life was his wife. And she had a massive stroke shortly after he was elected and was knocked out of participating in anything after that. And apparently after she was hit with the stroke, he wandered around going, what am I going to do now? Because he didn't really know how to run things. She was really the one who knew how to run things. Anyway, so Taft becomes president in 1908, and Taft actually busts more trust than Roosevelt did. And he tries to continue on Roosevelt's legacy, but he angers Roosevelt by attacking some of Roosevelt's policies head on. And most importantly, he takes on the tariff. And you really couldn't take on the tariff without infuriating a lot of old guard Republicans who were sort of quietly willing to go along with Roosevelt. Taft takes on the tariff, and when he goes to reform the tariff, he also doesn't really reform it. He basically just makes everybody mad, Republicans and Democrats. So Taft is not looking good in 1912. And when he runs for re-election in 1912, it's one of those landmark elections in the country, because in 1912, all of the people running are progressives. You have Taft, who is perceived as the most conservative, although he has been busting trusts at a greater rate than Roosevelt did. You have Roosevelt, who comes back and throws his hat in the ring as the head of what's known as the Bull Moose Party. He's going to try and become much more progressive than Taft was. You have the Democrats running Woodrow Wilson on another progressive platform, although it is different actually ideologically, although not practically, from what Taft and Roosevelt are talking about. And finally, you have Eugene V. Debs, who you probably don't remember me mentioning a while back. He actually runs as a socialist, and this is the high watermark of the socialist movement in political parties in America in 1912. Gene Debs gets 900,000 votes, about 1% of the voting population. That's the best the Socialist Party ever does, so it always fascinates me when Americans scream about how we are all becoming socialist. 1% of the population is not exactly a landslide. Anyway, in this election, the reason that it's important for many reasons. Partly, of course, because it's the transition into Woodrow Wilson and the historically landmark presidency of Woodrow Wilson. But it also shows how the Republican Party, by reforming from within, has managed to change the political conversation dramatically in 11 years. You know, in 1901, at the beginning of 1901, Northern Securities and U.S. Steel and Northern Securities show that big business has taken over the country, and that's what it looks like is going to happen. It is only 11 years later that every single person running for president is running on a completely different platform. So every time people say to me, oh, this is it, we're all done, you know, big business has taken over everything, nothing's going to change, I look at things like the election of 1912 and I say, you never could have seen this coming in 1900. What made the difference was reform from within the Republican Party and the very concerted use of the media, both from Teddy Roosevelt and from the muckrakers whom he hated, but who took a look at all the different levels of corruption in American society and convinced most Americans that it was good to be a 20th century liberal, to go ahead and regulate business and to provide a basic social safety net. And that's how the Republican Party goes from the Republican Party of the old guard, McKinley's old guard, to the Republican Party of Theodore Roosevelt. It gets that second rebirth of progressivism, of the idea that the government really should protect ordinary Americans and enable them to rise. All right, so there we go through the first 12 years, sorry about that, of the 20th century. And I will pick up next week with the Republicans during the presidency of Woodrow Wilson and where that's going to go. And that's a really interesting one, too, because Cabot Lodge is going to become very important, of course, in his destruction of the League of Nations. All right, terrific. I hope that was of use to you, and I will see you next week. Again, once again, I'm Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history. I do not speak for my employer when I do these. All right, thanks a lot. I will see you next week.